Hi, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to our webinar, Transforming Contingent Workforce Recruitment. Over the next 40 minutes or so, we'll focus on the options and benefits to having a strategy for recruiting and managing contingent workers. Contingent working is becoming increasingly significant, so we'll discuss the key considerations when setting goals and look at how to create efficiencies in the contingent recruitment process. We'll also focus on how we go about forming the right approach for your needs and how you can embed this in your organisation. We do expect there to be lots of questions, so please send them via the Q&A button that you can see at the bottom. We'll leave 20 minutes or so to address as many as we can at the end. Today's webinar is brought to you by the Giant Group, a leading contingent workforce management company for the last 30 years. The areas we're going to cover include contingent workforce trends, the increasing use of contingent workers and why, how to create efficiencies based on your desired outcomes, the options for enabling the change, how to embed the process and ensuring continuous improvement, and then questions and answers. Our keynote speakers are, first of all, Leah Boxall, the founder, CEO and principal consultant at Enablis, the PMO consultancy. Leah's focus is on making change simple and successful. A huge number of projects fail, and by this they either don't deliver the desired outcomes or they deliver something different, usually a compromised quality. Leah is helping businesses to successfully deliver their change programs and projects through effective PMO and change leadership. Her vast experience includes leading complex and critical transformation programs for companies such as Capita, SSE, NHS Professionals, and most recently, National Grid. In addition to this, in her position as Chief of Staff to the CEO at the NHS Professionals, Leah led the Silver and Gold command structures, which saw NHS professionals respond to the pandemic and respond to the task of getting as many people to the front line in the NHS as possible. Some of these activities included doubling the size of their bank, for instance, from 80 to 160,000, and setting up test and trace clinician team of 12,000 clinicians in a 21-day period. Amongst many other things, no mean feat. Leah's career has spanned every aspect of performance management and improvement and large-scale transformation, with a lot of time spent in the recruitment sector. From Giant, we have Dan Haslam, who's Group Sales Director, and his role includes helping clients to manage their contingent workforces compliantly and cost-effectively, using the whole range of Giant services and products. Dan is also a member of the board at the FCSA, the UK's leading membership body for umbrella companies, limited company accountants and CIS payroll providers. I'm David Hopkins, a workforce management consultant with Giant, and I'm going to be the chair for today. The format will be for Leah and Dan to answer a number of set questions, which I'll put to them in order to highlight the factors you need to consider and the options for delivering a successful outcome. There will be an opportunity, as I said, to put your questions at the end, so please submit them as we go. We'll see them appear on the toolbar and then we'll address them after the formal session. So let's begin with a look at contingent workforce trends and why it's becoming more significant in most organisations. Dan, good afternoon.
Good afternoon, Dave.
Good afternoon. Hi. The contingent workforce continues to grow in size and significance. What are the main factors driving this?
Yeah, well, good afternoon, Dave, and good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. There are obviously a number of different things at play here in terms of what's going on currently with the contingent workforce. There's obviously some pretty large macro trends that have been going on for a number of years, and then we've also got some short-term economic bits and pieces going on in not just in the UK but across Europe and the world. So I think the first thing just to qualify is when we're talking about contingent workers, I'm talking about anybody who is not a permanent employee of an organisation. So typically this can be people that are referred to as temps, as freelancers, contractors. People use different terminologies, but anyone who is providing work for an organisation who's not on the permanent payroll, I would classify them as contingent. And so roughly speaking, and it obviously varies between organisation to organisation, but typically, a relatively large business might see another 25% of the workforce that's actually engaged on that sort of basis, as opposed to sort of permanently employed. So when you're taking a look at trends at the moment and sort of what's going on in terms of the rise and ebb and flow of contingent working, and the first thing to flag is there's obviously some significant skill shortages that we're all experiencing as businesses. There was a big feeding frenzy last year in terms of a drive on recruitment, sort of coming back out of COVID and businesses really starting to gear up. That's obviously changed now. In 2023, we've seen that start to slow, but that doesn't mean that there's still not skill shortages that are causing businesses challenges. They absolutely are. And there's not enough people to fulfill roles, and we could talk a lot about the various factors around that, but to throw some sort of stats into the mix, recent report was reporting that 80% of employers are saying that their time to hire is increasing. Now, time to hire is a great indicator of how hard it is actually to bring talent into an organisation, and that's definitely on the increase. At a recent parliamentary event, Royal Mail was saying that their time to hire is at 67 days, which is, a significant length of time if people are trying to bring talent in. So what we do see is where there's still, even though there's skill shortages, there's still business need for people to get projects underway and get things moving. And not a quick fix, but a solution to that is to bring in contractors basically to be able to get that project moving in the absence of being able to hire people permanently. And we've certainly seen plenty of examples of that currently. Quite a bit of movement in IT, financial services, and also engineering that I've seen, where projects need to move forward. Employers have reduced the permanent headcount because they're right sizing due to the financial pressures out there, and they're looking at bringing contingent workers in to sort of fill that gap and move the projects forward. In terms of that time to hire that I mentioned, clearly permanent recruitment takes quite a long time. And if you're waiting 67 days to bring talent in, you need quicker wins. So it just makes complete sense for people to look at using contractors on that basis. From a cost perspective, from a wage perspective, there's obviously been lots of talk and stats around wage inflation over the last sort of 12 months, again driven by this talent gap, but also the cost of living crisis and the demand for wages to increase. So we're also seeing that have an impact on the market. Wages continue to increase from a permanent perspective, and that sort of feeds into the contingent piece as well. So in most sectors, contractors are also a bit more expensive than they were sort of 12 months ago. But obviously there's a tale to tell within each individual vertical. We're not in a particularly robust, or people aren't feeling very confident about the economy at the moment, certainly in the UK, but we also see that in the US and Europe, although there are some promising signs at the moment in the US that they're starting to pick up, and generally speaking, that has an impact in the UK and Europe 6 months hence. So where you've got businesses feeling a little bit less confident because of the economy, they will often look at restructuring, reduced permanent headcount, and that naturally seems to feed into an increase into contractors. We'll talk about that a bit more in a sec. And then also we've just got an increase now of people starting to look for work. So the numbers have been relatively stable in terms of, certainly in the UK, the employment market being quite saturated, but now we're starting to see the first increase in the number of people actually starting to look for work, and that's probably a trend that's happened for the first time for sort of 2 years, because we've been in this sort of bull market where there's just not been enough people to fulfill roles. So I think again that's probably reflective of the cost of living crisis, and the fact that people are sort of out there looking for work now that are falling out of permanent roles, Dave.
Okay, yeah, fine. So what sort of cyclical trends are you seeing then in the use of contingent workers in the market?
Well, I think in some respects it's the same story that we always see, which is when the economy tends to tighten, you'll see this sort of ebb away from businesses being confident to make permanent hires, and they'll look to try and bring in contractors, trying to make sure that their workforce is as flexible as possible. The reverse is true then when you look at the market once it's picked up and there's more confidence. You tend to see businesses wanting to bring in talent on a perm basis and commit to that spend. So that's always been a cycle. But I think what we're also seeing in particular at the moment is whilst that cycle ebbing and flowing, there's just a general trend that more flexibility is desirable, both for a hirer and also for job seekers and for contractors. So I think the general trend that we see is the macro trend is contracting is becoming more and more appealing to hirers because they're looking for flexibility. That's a big desire for them, whether the economy is strong or not. But then also, if you think about it from a contractor perspective, we're seeing that generally people are more interested now in taking flexible work. We know the impact of COVID and the fact that we all work remotely now, often from home, makes us feel a little bit more like we're working as a contractor. I think for young people, they can be attracted to that, not committing to a job role for 25 years with one organisation. A lot more flexibility is becoming desirable for those guys because they're seeking, different experiences. So I think that's also sort of feeding into this. So as always, the workforce and the job market is not static, it's dynamic. There's lots of factors feeding in. It's difficult to say it's heading in this specific direction. There's nuances, but I think it's definitely overall we can say with confidence there's a general trend that both job seekers and hirers to some extent are looking to engage more and more on a contingent basis because flexibility for both of them is really desirable.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Dan. So, Leah, good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Hi. So, in your experience then of working with both public and private sector clients, how have you seen hirers use contractors to form part of their workforce strategies?
Yeah, so similarly to what Dan just said, there is obviously the talent shortage. So especially where I work within the change space, people can't wait for the delay and wait for people to come on board at a later point because it is going to cause a delay in that change or transformation, and that will have a knock-on effect. I think also the uncertainty that we all face at the moment, people are choosing to maybe take a less risky approach, especially within the change space where people can obviously make that difference and can kind of have that switch on, switch off type model. I think the other thing is I'm seeing more and more companies kind of taking that cultural shift to looking at partnering with suppliers on outcome-based deliverables. So actually giving other suppliers and making sure that they have skin in the game to actually deliver the work itself. And that's quite an interesting model, I think, that we're starting to see come in around that outcome-based deliverables. And I think we'll start to see a little bit more of that in the future as well, as companies can kind of share that risk with their suppliers.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Leah. And Dan, you touched on the changing attitudes of contractors there a bit earlier. So let me come back to you. And from a supplier point of view, as you are, what have you seen in a bit more detail in workers' attitudes in their changing approach to work?
I touched on it, I suppose, a little bit in the introduction there. Definitely sort of post-pandemic and that continuation of home working, I think, has made the prospect of people thinking about moving into freelancing and becoming a contractor less scary, because it's kind of like, we work from home and we're on our own steam in a lot of environments. So I think that definitely has played a part in softening people's nervousness about moving into contracting work. Candidates definitely, I think, are looking for more flexible working where possible, and conditions that perm positions can't give them. So, calling out an example, working home mothers that have got kids at school, works perfectly for them to be able to work from home. And there's lots of good work being going on by both organisations and recruitment businesses to pull those types of candidates now in, which were previously where business was saying, you've got to be permanent, you've got to work in the office. There was just no access to that talent. So because of that shortage of talent, it's forcing businesses to sort of review how they operate, and that's being driven by the attitudes of the workers and the desire of the workers as to how they want to work. So it's just meaning that everyone's just got to rethink and sort of redraw exactly how we want to engage people. And there's some great positive stories about the access to talent that gives to people that might have previously not been able to get into the market. And there's definitely no stigma these days to people changing job roles. I think it's less the norm now that people stay with organisations for a prolonged period of time. Generally speaking, it seems like people are looking for much more variety in the work, and clearly contracting lends itself to that sort of variety and changing it up, different businesses and different experiences. I think for some as well, despite the current economic trends, making a move into contracting can actually work out as a good financial move for people, where they can demand a premium for the pay. Although that said, there's a little bit of a counter to that. I think we did see in the early stages when the labour market was tightening up, perhaps some contractors that were getting left roles or were being projects were being put on hold and they were being pushed out of roles, were looking initially for more perm work. But it's pleasing to say I've seen examples recently in a couple of sectors now where actually those roles are available and people are going back in because they do prefer to work on a freelancer perspective. So you've got that going on. I think with some of the higher paid roles that we have in contracting as well, a big demand for workers to look at the businesses that they're engaging with and to make sure that they're offering options and benefits that wouldn't normally be offered to contractors. There would normally be the preserve of a permanent workforce. So, for example, I'm thinking about pensions. Lots of workers now working on a contract basis, but on an inside IR35 basis in the UK. Are asking, for there to be some flexible arrangements put in place for pension contributions so they can benefit from tax relief on that. So normally speaking, a hirer who's looking at engaging contractors on a fixed term contract basis on payroll wouldn't be looking at offering complex pension deduction type arrangements there, or they might have been advised to sort of keep workers at arm's length from these sorts of arrangements because it could cause some issues around tax, and that's historically been a narrative that's been played in the contingent market for some time. So workers becoming a little bit more demanding because they know they can, because hirers are desperate for talent. And I think the other thing that I just tack onto the back of this as well in terms of different worker attitudes is flexibility on where they want to do the work. And that's not just geographically within a country. So we've seen many examples now where workers are actually quite happy to move over and relocate and work in different countries, either because it's a lifestyle choice, perhaps it's a reaction to the cost of living crisis in some countries where they prefer to move elsewhere for a cheaper cost of living, but also businesses quite keen to look at taking contractors on that work in different countries as well. So, it doesn't have to be that a UK role has to be fulfilled by a UK contractor. I've got numerous examples where there's project teams being put together on an SOW basis, like Leah mentioned, where you might have a project manager in South Africa and an IT person from Pakistan all coming together to work on a project. And also some contractors looking at moving into different countries to also take advantage of tax regimes. So, for example, in near Europe, some countries, Bulgaria, Romania, there's some pretty favourable income tax regimes in comparison to the UK, for example. So I've seen examples of contractors moving there to leverage that, or moving across into places like Dubai to work. Obviously not for everybody, but again, such a complex narrative going on in that contingent space at the moment, where people are moving around and different trends driving different behaviours. So it is not dull and it's not static, Dave.
Yeah, indeed. Yeah. So contingent labour is then becoming an essential tool to give us that breadth of approach we need in a workforce management strategy. So next question then is, how should we aim to get the best out of it? Let me put that to you, Leah.
Yeah, so I think first and foremost, you need to be really clear on your desired outcomes. So what are you trying to achieve, but be really specific. So are you looking to create efficiencies, for example, in a process, but being specific around actually where is the lag now? Where is it the efficiencies that you can go after? Is it around cost? Which specific costs are you trying to reduce and by how much? I think if it's a risk, you've got a whole host of things that you could be looking at to reduce risk. So is it about not having resource needs met by your current processes? Is it around the need for permanent heads and not being kind of making sure that you're not going too far in the current climate? So that bit earlier around kind of, I suppose, limiting your risk? Or is it actually back to that point I was making earlier around the risk in delaying the starting of work whilst you wait for a permanent person to start? Obviously, that could have quite a knock-on effect to something that you're trying to do from a change or a transformation perspective. I think also, is it about increasing control? Because I think that can be another outcome that's probably one that's relevant. But again, what is it that you're looking to create? Is it more a consistent way of working? So we know many organisations have many different ways of doing things. So actually, is it about trying to create that kind of consistent way of working for your teams? Or is there another control element that you're trying to create? So I think it's about being really specific. I think the next part that I would say is what's in it for your team. So you need to highlight the benefits to them, but also ensure that their commitment to a consistent and a common approach. And I think that's where we probably fall down on a lot of these kind of things in the early days. I think to keep them engaged, you need to be honest with them on what you're trying to achieve and keep them informed as you progress. So if things aren't going as you expect, be honest about it and actually talk to them about what the plan is to try and get back on track. I think creating valuable supplier partnerships. So be really clear why you want people to help you, agree how you're going to measure this collectively and doing that from the start. So if things start to not necessarily go the way you're expecting, there's no kind of surprise when you go to have that conversation around actually this isn't really working at the moment, what are we going to do? I think you would expect me to say this. Make sure you create a plan and check in against your business case. So things are going to happen, scope is going to change, and you're going to need to make sure that you can make an informed decision and make a decision around whether this is still the right thing to do for your business. And if it's not a failure. There'll be other options available. So I think learning from those experiences, but you can only do that if you're really, really clear on what your scope is and what your outcomes are that you're trying to drive in the first place. So I would say that's really important. And then lastly, I'd kind of end with, to change and implement a new way of working, you need to run it as a project itself. So have people focused on it. You need to approach this in a pragmatic and simple way. And I think you can use that and make sure that your team kind of go through that journey, and that will bring people on board. So I think they're some of the more important items, I would say.
Leah, I was just going to just chip in there. I think I thought it was really interesting what you're saying about trying to making sure that you're getting people within the organisation to buy into it with that message around what's in it for me. So I think there's plenty of implementations we've been involved in and projects where obviously there's been a decision that's been made at a senior level that this is the direction of travel, this is the way we want to go. But in any organisation, but particularly larger organisations, trying to get that message to flow down to the teams is not often done very well by businesses to understand, okay, what is the benefit going to be for me in making this change? So I don't know if there's any good examples you could give or any ideas around how you deliver that and how you keep everyone on the bus with you, really.
Yeah, and I think I would say it's, don't mislead yourself around the obvious. So as people, we're not great with change. And when change is coming and we say we're going to create an efficiency, everybody first thinks, what does that mean to my job? So if it's an efficiency you're trying to create, I would be really open and honest around why is it you're trying to create that efficiency and what does that do? So is it that actually you don't want people to be sitting processing where technology could potentially do something, or another company could come in and do something, because actually you want your people to be doing the value added tasks and creating those kind of conversations and that engagement piece. So I think it's about making sure that you work through that, and that's why I'm saying be specific around it, because if you're not specific, you can't take those people on that journey. So you need to kind of keep going through the why until you get to that point that you can answer really, really clearly to people, this is what the change is and this is what it means for you and this is what it doesn't mean for you. So if an efficiency isn't going to mean that you're going to do job losses and things like that, be really open that that's not the desire and that's not the approach that you're looking to take, but actually you're trying to create a more efficient process that means you get people onboarded, and then this is what you want your people to go on to do. So I think it's really leaning into that.
I think you're spot on there, aren't you? Soon, like you say, when there's change, people will be nervous, particularly when you're talking about, these sorts of models around workers and how people are engaged. But that's not always the case. It's not always the driver that this is about rationalisation, and it's a cost driven project. There could be many different reasons why it's done, and sometimes I think businesses are maybe a bit nervous, or maybe they get wrapped up in the nervousness of disturbing their employees, to actually highlight what the benefits are and the reasons why the business is going in this direction. Because if it's good for the business, it should be good for the workforce. Yeah,
I completely agree. And the biggest disruptor can be not answering those unanswered questions, because people will come up with the answers themselves, and that's the bigger danger.
Yeah, they're good at filling in the gaps. Yeah.
There's another level to this as well, I think, isn't there, which I'm sure we'll touch on later, and that's about getting the commitment of the hiring managers, because it's a change to their process, and it's a change to their level of control and their direct access to people. So they need to be brought along and understand exactly what they're trying to achieve out of this, as well as the actual delivery team. Yeah,
I completely agree. I think I've seen some examples on that, Dave, where actually businesses have done such a good job in putting together a really slick process for onboarding contractors and engaging contractors, that you've actually seen behaviours from hiring managers flip the other way, where they've actually brought in contractors instead of actually hiring permanent staff, because they didn't want to wait 60 days to bring someone in, and actually it was super easy to bring contractors in. But if they're not got the necessary controls in that can suddenly start running away with itself as well. So there should always be a story to be told out to the hiring managers of the business as to why it's beneficial for them to review this. And if it is cost reduction, people will buy into that, but it's probably about being straightforward about the messaging and being upfront about it.
Exactly that.
Okay, so if we're clear then on the outcomes that we aim to achieve, let's have a look at the options to deliver them. Dan, will you give us an overview of the different approaches that might be available to us at the moment?
Yeah, I think, well, it's easy to say, if we're clear about the outcomes. I think in practice there's a real piece of work there to be laser focused on what it is that you're looking to achieve by reviewing that contingent workforce strategy. They did a great job in talking through some of those earlier. I think the keys that I see, it's either going to be, it is a cost reduction exercise or a cost control exercise, but equally it can be about focusing on reducing risk within the business as to how contractors are engaged, which suppliers are used. Plenty of different risks around getting that wrong for businesses. And it can also be that it's neither of those things, but it's actually just about improving the candidate experience and making it a better process for a contractor to come into the business, on board nice and quickly, have a great experience, be paid in the way they want to be paid, at a frequency that they want to be paid, and then move on to another piece of work. There's loads of good work that gets done on permanent hiring processes to make them super cool, really engaging, really tech savvy, and often the contractor piece can lag behind. But as we said, if these contractors are becoming more and more important to a business in the workforce strategy, then I'm sure that's an area where people would want to add value. So be absolutely clear on what it is that you're trying to deliver, because it's very easy to get caught between some of those stools. And I'll put it out there, there's also obviously another obvious option, which is businesses can choose to do nothing. So you might well identify that there is an issue in the process, but it may be felt in the business that it's not substantive enough to require a change or a new model or whatever people want to do. So doing nothing is an option. And it's often a case that that can be taken when there's other pressures within the business, because we know what it's like. We operate and focus very much, all of us, in that sort of HR and contingent space, but there's also a business operating that has other demands around it. So doing nothing is an option, but as long as you've considered that with regards to the outcomes, and you've put together a business case as to why do nothing's the right thing to do, then that is a perfectly legitimate outcome as well. The timing might just not be right now. What I see in the market a lot of, I suppose, generally is a lot of businesses look to manage their contractors through a preferred supplier list of recruitment agencies that will do the recruitment piece and then go on to do the management of the contractors as well. And that's perfectly valid and works for lots and lots of different organisations. But I think there's a crux there of trying to understand, are we engaging those suppliers because we've got a recruitment challenge? So we've not got our own in-house team, or we've got our own in-house team, but we need more resource. So we need other recruitment businesses to come and support. Or are we actually engaging those recruitment businesses because we're wanting these contractors to be managed and we've no in-house solution for doing that? So it just feels right that we plug a recruiter in. So I think, again, comes back to what's the challenge you're trying to solve here. Is it a recruitment challenge, or is it a workforce management challenge, or is it a payroll tax risk challenge that you're trying to satisfy? You could obviously take the option to bring everything in-house. So you could look at managing the whole process internally. So you could pull your recruitment in if you're doing that externally, bring that in-house, and also bring the management of the contractors in as well. There's obviously a lot of benefits for looking at doing that. It should mean that the process is a bit more consistent. You're a lot more closer to the detail then, because you're owning that process rather than outsourcing it to other suppliers. Is that realistic though for a lot of businesses? Have they got the bandwidth to be able to pull all those tax in-house? That's a decision that you'd need to weigh up. You don't have to go the whole hog and bring everything in-house. There's also, you can do it in parts. So you might decide, actually, we will look at leaving our recruitment partners to do the recruitment piece, because we need that support. We need their skills to bring the talent into the business. But what we'll look to do is we'll look to manage the process, and we'll look at engaging a supplier to help manage the onboarding and the payrolling of the contractors. Or you could go to the other extreme, which is to bring in a managed service provider, an MSP model as it's referred to, where basically that MSP provider comes in and just puts their arms around the whole process. So rather than having it all in-house, you've now outsourced the full process, and that can include recruitment and the workforce management piece as well. So it fundamentally depends on what the challenges you're trying to fix. My mantra is, I think that wherever possible, businesses should try and engage companies to leverage their core skill set. So if it's a recruitment challenge, absolutely engage with recruitment businesses to deliver search and selection. If it's a workforce management piece and it's a risk perspective, then absolutely bring in a specialist that's skilled at managing that part of the process. And that way, once you've done that and you've got specific suppliers in place, hold that supplier accountable. So make sure you form some strong SLAs that you want to hold that supplier accountable for delivering on that particular part of the process. And Leah used the phrase earlier, which I liked, which is just, get them to share some of the risk within that. You might want to put some deliverables into a contract to say, yeah, we're happy, we want your support on this particular area, but let's have some SLAs that back up the outcomes that you've decided you want to achieve. But I then think finally, though, just be realistic as well about what you're trying to achieve here. As I said, there's likely to be many different reasons in a business why it's a good idea to sort of reevaluate your contingent workforce management program and look at making some changes. Stay focused on your first pain point, or maybe your first and second pain point. If you can then achieve that with the project, then that'll be a great tick in the box and you've been successful. If you try and create utopia, you're going to probably fail, and you're probably going to frustrate your business in delivering that. There is no harm in breaking projects down into phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, and just be realistic about what you can achieve. Because if you can get some deliverables met, if you can put something in place which is a positive change for the business, I think it'll do wonders for keeping people with you, as we were talking about in that earlier section, and bringing the rest of the business with you by making some sensible steps rather than going to go from A to Z in a short space of time. It doesn't generally work very well.
Yeah. Okay. So driven by the required outcomes, then, what are some of the risks that we're aware of in relation to contract arrangements? What do we need to be aware of in terms of how we approach this?
Is this the bit, Dave, where you hand over to me just to scare the bejesus out of everybody and yeah, make my outsource everything?
Take their shoelaces and their belts off them. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I think most people that have operated in the sector for some time will have an awareness that there's various risks that are involved when you're looking at trying to manage contractors. I think one of the things I would say is no matter what the specific risk is that you're looking at, the more suppliers that you have built up in your supply chain, then the more likely it is that you're building a platform where there could be an increase in risk, because you're becoming more and more detached from what's going on at ground level, because you've got a number of different suppliers in a chain. I'm not saying that it's practical in all instances to look at just having, one supplier involved to manage a process, but I think wherever possible, procurement are always keen to try and look at shortening that supply chain where you can. Where if you're going to pick a supplier to come into the environment and manage workers, then you need to be assured on a number of different things from a risk perspective. So the basics would be obviously financial stability. Contractors can be quite significant. As we know, there are businesses failing out there at the moment because of the tightening of the market. So you should be doing your basic financial checks to make sure that the suppliers that you're introducing are financially robust and they're going to be able to deliver your service in the long term. So I think that's an absolute key. I think one area where I'd say is there's a number of suppliers often in this climate, or hirers rather, request suppliers to put in quite lengthy payment terms. I think there's got to be maybe I'm being ambitious to say this, but there should be an element of being realistic in that request, and not to put the suppliers under too much duress that they basically can fail to deliver. And we've seen examples of that in the construction industry in the UK at the moment, where suppliers have been strung out for long terms and actually there's business failures as a result. So clearly it'll be a desire to have payment terms in there, and you can look to do that, but I think it's an element of reasonableness and coming to an agreement with a supplier where they're comfortable on that setup. So financial for sure. Obviously then we can move on to areas like tax. So there's been loads of noise in the UK for several years now around the changes around IR35 and processing contractors who are working like employees to be taxed as employees. And I'm sure that the rest of Europe has looked on in bafflement, really, because if you look at the rest of the world, generally speaking, it's very, very clear out there that if you're engaging a contractor and if they're working like an employee, they should pay tax like an employee. So the IR35 changes we've experienced in the UK have just brought, I think, the UK in line with the rest of the world, which I'd see as a positive, given that we're in this globalized world and people are moving around. But worker classification is key. The penalties for getting that wrong, whether in the UK or in the US, we've seen examples of some of the gig economy providers in the US falling foul of these rules, like Uber, getting themselves into trouble around worker classification, and that can lend itself to large fines and penalties. So worker classification is important. Make sure suppliers, if they're going to be involved in that, have got good, robust tests around it, and you're comfortable that the right determinations are being made. Moving back to the UK specifically, we've obviously got, for those that aren't aware, there's a current consultation has taken place around the use of umbrella companies in the supply chain. That consultation closed in August, and we're expecting to hear back from the government in sort of November time as to the views on what they should do to try and improve the compliance of the umbrella market as an industry. They've put a long story short, they've put forward 3 options as to how they see that happening. I think I'm of the opinion, as most of the other commentators are, it's highly likely that the option they'll go for is to transfer that tax risk up the supply chain to a hirer. So in the event that a hirer has a non-compliant payroll provider operating in the supply chain and the right levels of tax aren't being deducted, I think it's highly likely we're going to see that tax risk is transferred up the supply chain, and ultimately that hits the hirer. We've seen that was the approach that was taken around IR35, and it drove massive changes in the market in terms of behaviours. So not a great news story for the hirers that are on the call, but more and more risk being put on you guys to police the market because the tax authorities struggle to do it themselves with a lack of resource. So it becomes the burden of people further up the supply chain to make sure that they've got the right activity taking place. And that obviously feeds into the reason why I'm suggesting you should shorten your supply chains where possible, because the less suppliers that are involved, then the chances are you've got the ability to be able to monitor risk there. But also don't lose sight of the fact that if you do reduce those supply chains, there should also be some good efficiencies in improving the process, both for you as a business, but also the contractor. So, for example, multiple suppliers might mean there's multiple timesheeting products that the contractor has to engage with to get paid, or different types of screening providers that need to be engaged with to make sure that they can onboard correctly, which isn't a great experience for that contractor. So again, shortening your supply chain and giving specific roles to specific suppliers, it's probably got multiple benefits.
Yeah, and I think if you check those suppliers out, as you said earlier, your basic financial checks and reputational things you can find out, then shorter supply chains, you get a better experience for the contractor, and you're in more control of what's happening, and it is very successful in many cases. Yeah,
I think it's just, and there's levels to it, Dave. So you could take the approach of going down the rabbit hole and going into infinite detail on supplier compliance, or you can take a very light touch approach. I think that the best place to be is probably somewhere in the middle, but for different businesses, it might well be appropriate to go down the rabbit hole and go through detail. But one thing I can assure everyone on is that we hear and see more and more activity taking place from tax authorities on businesses to ensure that they are engaging contractors correctly. And that's not a message to put people off on in doing so, because as we've spoken about, there's an absolute business need to do it. Just make sure you've got the right processes. But too often I see it being very much Wild West when people trying to engage contractors, and I think we can do better than that.
Yeah, which probably brings us on to a couple of other things. What else would you add here, Leah, and what we need to consider, and some of the other aspects to this in the round?
Yeah, so I think, so I completely agree with everything that Dan just said. I think there is also the balance, though, when it comes to contractors around the change mindset that we need to go through. So I think because of some of the fear that we all have traditionally, we keep contractors completely at arm's length. But I think you've got to balance that with you're using contracts to deliver something specific for you. So actually there does still need to be a level of engagement. Now, engagement is very different to treating them as an employee. So I think there is that kind of balance and act that we do need to look at that says, how do we make them feel engaged and let them know how they're doing and how it's progressing and how they're moving the business forward, that will ultimately drive that kind of performance that you would expect of anybody that's kind of coming in, because you are paying them to do a piece of work for you. So you should still have that level of performance there, but not going through a performance management. As I say, it's more of an engagement thing. So I think there is that piece there. I think I go back to the outcome based agreements as well. I think I do see that this will increase more and more, because I think more companies will want to share the burden of the risks. But in doing that, you need to make sure that you've got those measures and you've got the opportunities with the company to hold them to account if they're not delivering, and be really, really specific about that. And I think that needs to be the agreement kind of going into the relationship, but also being really clear that that is something that you're going to do going on. And I go back to my earlier point. If it's not working, don't feel like you're stuck. I think quite often when we partner with people or we decide on a solution, we think, well, we've gone through this change, or we're going through this change, so we're now stuck there. Actually, if it's the wrong thing, just learn from it, and learn from it as quickly as you possibly can, and then see actually what the other options are. But just because you've started a piece of work or a project to try and move to a different approach for any of this kind of stuff doesn't mean that you've got to carry on if it's not going to work for you. And that comes back to being really clear what your outcomes, what is your business case, because if you haven't got those two things, you can't make that informed decision as to whether you're going to deliver it or not.
Yeah, okay. And we've spoken in some detail as to why transformation and change management are crucial in the successful implementation of new approaches. But once we've got there to the start line, once we've decided to go, what do we need to do to ensure we get the best value and that we get continuous improvement once we've got to that new way of working?
Yeah, so I think the first thing, and I'm not sure that everybody does this, but I think it is really important, is that you relate the measures back to the strategy and the expected outcomes. So making sure that you understand what your non-negotiables, because that's where you're going to be able to make that decision point. Are my non-negotiables being compromised here? Therefore, actually, do we need to have that decision of a go, no go, and we do something different? But if you're not clear on that, you won't be able to have that decision. I think reviews with the hiring managers, I think you called it out earlier, Dave, that they're such an important part, especially in this kind of change and project, but actually having reviews with them around what does success look like, how are we going to measure, and how are we going to update you. So you're going to take them on a huge change journey, that some of them will absolutely be behind, some of them might not be, and actually making sure that you work with them on what is the success criteria so that they feel like they have input to the process as well. So I think that's really important. Defining your suitable measures and KPIs. KPIs is one of those things that some people kind of will work with KPIs and they'll work with them religiously. Others will kind of go, well, that's one of those things that we're just going to do off the side of the desk. KPIs need to be a daily thing. You need to be living and breathing them. And if you have the KPIs, you will be able to make sure that you are on track. And I think that's where the continuous improvement bit goes. Once you deliver this, the KPIs continue. You don't just stop because you've delivered. You need to be constantly looking at how is the performance going. So some examples of the KPIs you would have is cost. It's a really easy one. We always like to focus on cost. It's the easiest subject of all, isn't it? So making sure that you're looking at all of the kind of cost elements, but also the costs that you're not having to cover, because there'll be that element to it as well. So it's not only what costs are you covering, but what are the costs that are going away. I think you've got the time to hire is another really good measurement. I think, you know, we can deem that it can be quicker sometimes to hire a contractor and get them started, but I think you need to be really clear around actually what are your process steps around onboarding somebody and getting them work ready, and what is the productivity timeline, and actually measuring that and comparing that to your contractors, to your permanent people, because we said earlier, contractors don't necessarily get treated in the same way. So you might find that actually it goes one way or the other depending on your induction processes. So I would definitely consider that. I think you've also got the bit around the risk. So what is the risk that you're trying to reduce, and making sure that you've got the profile on how it's moving. Is it increasing or is it decreasing? And then the control requirements. So we were talking about that a little bit earlier on, but actually, are your teams complying with your control requirements? Are people continuing to use the process, or actually are we finding other ways of going around it? Because actually that is going to knock on to your wider vision as to why you were doing this in the first place. So and making sure, and if people aren't doing it, do you know why? Do you know why people aren't choosing to do the process? Is it actually because it doesn't work for them, and actually for a user experience, for a hiring manager or a HR, a recruitment talent advisor, actually the process doesn't work? Dig under the skin of why that's not working, and then make sure that you address that through the continuous improvement. So I think that's really important. I think the other thing that we sometimes kind of maybe miss is that we should absolutely have qualitative and quantitative measures. So actually making sure that you're kind of getting the verbal updates, the surveys and things like that, as well as looking at the figures and what they're saying. And I think you can't look at one in isolation, you need to look at both. So I would definitely make sure that you've got that piece. And then, as I said, keep looking at it, keep measuring it, keep reviewing it once you've implemented it. I think too many on too many occasions, we'll implement something like this, which is a new service or a new way of operating, and then we'll kind of go, right, well, that's done. We're going to move that into the corner and we're going to go and move on to the next thing. But actually things will change, things will start to creep in, and you need to be able to make sure that you're able to quickly spot those and kind of drive through that continuous improvement. So yeah, I would say there's some measures specifically around this topic.
Okay, thank you. Yeah. So Dan, for those people who are listening who are perhaps at the start of this journey and thinking about how they might implement a workforce management strategy to include contractors, give them some hope here. Well, what have you seen from the market of the benefits that accrue from this, from a well thought out approach to managing contingent workers, as opposed to just simply adding contractors without a clear operating model in mind? What can you tell us about the real benefits you've seen out there?
A lot less stress out there, guys. I think that'd be the headline, really. I think if you've been operating in a place where there's not been a clear model, you probably knew that there were certain areas of that process that weren't quite right, that might have been stressing you out, whether that was from a risk perspective or a delivery perspective. So I think when you've got the right model in place for you, you feel calmer because you've got control. And I think control is a key word throughout this. It's very easy for your contingent world to get out of control quite quickly, and that's where the stress levels come about. So I think that would be point one. The side benefits then of having that control is, with the right process, it should help you to attract and retain contractor talent in exactly the same way that you've got that proposition to attract and retain permanent talent. A good onboarding experience is great. There's there's a number of platforms out there now where contractors talk to each other. They're very well networked, so if they get a bad experience with a hirer, that can get fed back into the market. But equally, they're all still also quite openly make positive statements as well. So I think there's a few products out there, a little bit like the glass door for contractors, where they can make comment on where they can work well with businesses. So I think it's really important that you've got that contractor value proposition, and it will just help feed into your ability to attract that talent. Costs, obviously, as Leah said, is an obvious one. There's always be an opportunity to look at cost reduction, or it could be it's not cost reduction, it's just comfort that you are spending the right money and you're getting the right delivery. More times than not, when you put a model in place that gives full visibility to that contingent workforce, there are some obvious cost savings to be had, and people are running fat. But there are occasions where actually businesses re-review this and go, do you know what? We probably need to reinvest in this area to push it along. But perhaps some of the other things that were stopping us from being comfortable operating contractors was holding us back. So it's not always the case that it's a cost reduction piece. It could actually be the reverse. I think now for some businesses where they may be lighter on contractors, it makes complete sense to look at re-engineering a process. So it might be a little bit less disruptive to do that now. Or certainly before you're starting to take on big projects, it's a good point to sort of re-review it and do that rather than trying to do it in the midst of a key project for your business. So if there are those fallow periods where things are quieter, which it is the case for some businesses, then now's a perfect time to sort of re-review the process. I think you'll feel more comfortable because you'll have much more visibility to what's going on, and you'll feel in control. Like we've said, you'll be comfortable with the suppliers that you have. You'll be comfortable with the way that you're engaging your contractors. To again reinforce Leah's point, you won't be fearful around things like worker classification and treat them like pariahs. You'll be treating them as an integral part of your strategy to deliver outcomes for your business. And so with all that, you're going to get time back as well. And so I think that's the other thing that is often surprises clients when they go through this process, is the amount of time that comes back into hiring managers, finance, talent attraction professionals, because they've got a process now that works, and there's so much time being spent on sticking plasters to get workers from A to B and payments from A to B and contractors onboarded from A to B, that actually it gives everyone a lot of bit of time back to actually focus on the day job, because people shouldn't be swallowed up completely in trying to manage a contractor.
Yeah.
Good. Great. OK, thank you. So conscious of time now, thank you both for a great insight. I think we got both sides and a great view there of what we might be needing to do. I think we're obviously all aware that the contingent workers are becoming an essential part of this holistic workforce management strategy as they provide that necessary flexibility. There are differences, as we pointed out. We need to be aware of those, but I think you've given us a great overview and several pointers on how to approach it successfully. We've got a few good questions here now, which I'd be keen to get to for the next 7 or 8 minutes to bring us to a close. So if we're ready to do those, let me start with the first one I've got here, which is, how do we know the best route for us in options around contingent workforce? Leah.
So I think, again, it comes back to what is the outcome that you're trying to achieve. I think if you're clear on that, then you've got your requirements as a minimum, and then I think you can go and explore who out there in terms of a supplier is going to be able to meet those requirements. And I think it comes back to Dan's point earlier. Are you trying to resolve a recruitment issue? Are you trying to resolve a retention issue? Are you trying to make sure that you get resources in quickly because actually you've got a change program or you've got something else that you need to deliver? So I think it's about really being specific around that, and then looking at the suppliers that will help you solve that problem would be my view.
Yeah. Dan?
Yeah, I think I agree. I think in your initial discovery phase, just keeping an open mind. I've seen a few times where people thought that the main challenge was X, and then as they start to go through it, they go, oh crikey, we just found out Y, and Y is bigger than X. So actually we're off and running down this route, and now we're having to do a bit of a pivot and go the other way. So don't think that it's a clear path. Do your due diligence, do a bit of discovery, and then start to build out your model. I think Leah alluded it to when she said that there's a number of programs that head off in a direction and then all of a sudden start trying to change on the hoof. And that's often because there's a few stones that haven't been unturned in the process, and they've found some nasties. Exactly that.
Okay. And the next one here from somebody who obviously recognises that changes can be quite difficult. How difficult will it be to change our approach in contingent workforce?
So I'll go for the start of that. Again, I think it's about recognising the scale of the change that you're about to go through, but being really specific around what it's going to be the knock-on to the people that you're taking on that journey, and making sure that you understand everybody that's involved. So it's not just the recruitment team or the hiring managers, it's actually people that are going to be working with the teams and the people being onboarded as well, and that you're making sure that you're really clear around what it is and why you're doing it. I would say, I think to Dan's point a second ago, change happens in change. So not being completely rigid around actually what it is that you think is the end goal. So and making sure that you've got the opportunities to review back to say, actually, is this still working for us? So it comes back to what is the scope, what is the benefits of what you're trying to achieve, and what are your non-negotiables? Because I think that's the bit that gives you the option to be able to say, actually, we need to pause here, or actually we can continue because this is still not affecting our non-negotiables. So yeah, I think they would be the two big things for me. And I think if you're doing anything like this, run it as a project, because it is a project, it is a change. And I think too often we think that everybody can do this off the side of their desk. This is quite big, not just in terms of actually the user journey of everybody involved, but also thinking about, do you fully understand the processes that it's going to impact? Because it's not just about a recruitment and onboarding process, it will impact many other processes along the line. So being sure that you understand what the impacts are to that, because that's where you will find the kind of the not discovered nasties that will come back and bite you along the line. So making sure that you really understand what is that end-to-end process that you're looking at.
Yeah. And well, this next one is at a slightly lower level of detail, I guess, but very important. It knocks on from what you just said, and it's about how can you get everyone within the business to follow the process determined by the options we choose. So I guess you've laid it all out, but it's then how do you implement it and bring people with you? So yeah, and it's winning the hearts and minds, and recognizing that not everybody will have the same change journey and take the same approach. So some people will want to be communicated to in a kind of open forum where they can ask questions. Some people will be more reflectors, and actually that won't suit them. So actually they'll like to be given the opportunity to maybe come back and ask questions other way. And I think it's about making sure that, one, you understand and reflect that everybody will go through that change journey differently, and making sure that you've got the different options and you give people the time as well to go through the change journey, keeping them informed. That was something NHS professionals, when we were in the pandemic, we did religiously. We kept the whole business informed around what was going on, how were we doing, good and bad, so that everybody feels that they're a part of the journey and is understanding that actually it's not all plain sailing at all times. Actually, sometimes there are going to be hiccups along the way, but this is actually how we're going to deal with it, or we need your input to deal with it. And then actually, what is the measurement? So not only communicating and saying what we're doing, but actually showing them, is it moving?
moving the dial as you expect it to. I think too often we sometimes don't necessarily share some of the more granular level of detail of actually how are we performing and how is things changing and the KPIs and things like that, but actually be transparent about it. Let people see what the impact is of it, and how it's progressing would be my pointers.
Dan?
And also just, yeah, chuck in there as well, I think often when you're doing these changes, there's going to be not only the hiring managers that are feeling like, oh, there's change here, but also don't forget the contractors. Yeah, the contractors are going to change. They'll have some reservations around it potentially because it's a new process that they need to go through. So I think making sure that you've got a clear communication strategy to the contractors. Doesn't always have to just be email. We frequently host webinars just like this where we'll do a drop in and we'll say, if you've got any questions, jump on the call and have an opportunity to speak to people. It won't surprise people on the call to know that not all the contractors turn up for it, but at least the offer's been made and you can point to the fact that you've done that. You know, a well-crafted FAQ document's great. Again, people might not read it, but you're making the effort to try and address some of those headline queries that they might have, and that keeps them on the bus with you, because the hiring managers will often react to noise that's coming back from these contingent workers, and it just reinforces how important they are to those hiring managers. So don't forget those guys as well.
And just remember, naturally, we focus on the negatives in the main. Not saying everybody is. There are some very fantastic and amazing people who are very positive, but there are a lot of people that will kind of, their first thought will go, what does that mean for my security, my position, all of that sort of stuff. So don't leave those things out there, because they'll make their own decisions around what that means.
Okay, now it's 2 o'clock. There are a number of other questions left. So what I would say is, if you've got specific questions and you'd like them to be addressed, then we will send details of Dan and Leah's contact information so that you can pick them up separately if you wish to. But in the meantime, many thanks to our 2 experts today. Thank you for your attention. I trust it's been worthwhile. Hope you've enjoyed it, and we've been able to give you some insights and some hope, perhaps, that all this could be, you know, a whole new world. We will be following up with an email. We'll have a link to the recording of today's session, and we'll send you a quick questionnaire just to see what you've thought, and hopefully hope that it's been useful for you. Thanks again to Leah and to Dan. And good luck with your contingent workforce planning strategies as you go forward. Please do keep in touch and have a great day. Thank you.
Thanks everyone. Thanks, Dave.
Cheers. Thank you all.